All right, so let's get started. So as Tong mentioned today, I'll be talking to you about building spatial statistical models in R using spmodel. A little bit about me. I got my PhD in statistics in 2020 from Oregon State University. My research interests primarily are in spatial statistics, applications to ecology, and software development. I maintain a few packages on CRAN, spmodel, SSN2, and spsurvey, and I'm the lead statistician for US EPA's National Aquatic Resource Surveys program. So what are the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, or the NARS? They're a collaboration between EPA as well as states and tribes to assess the quality of our nation's aquatic resources using what we call a statistical survey design or probability sampling. We sample all of our aquatic resources in the US, so this includes surveys for lakes, rivers and streams, our wetlands, our coastal waters, as well as the Great Lakes. Sampling takes place for these on 5-year cycles, usually during the summer. And so I have a link here in the slides, which you can check out if you want some more information and a reference for some history. A quick tentative roadmap for the talk today. I'll quickly talk about some big picture ideas about why spatial models, specifically for spatial data, are worth learning about. And then we'll dive into a little bit of technical background that will motivate our main discussions about what is spatial covariance and then what are spatial linear models. And then if there's time, we'll also talk about some applications to large data sets as well as spatial generalized linear models too. So some fun stuff. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the linear model. So simple and multiple linear regression models, in other words, linear models, are really important ecological tools. They're generally written with this structure here. We have y, which is our response variable, sometimes called the dependent or the outcome variable. We have these x's, which are explanatory variables, sometimes called covariates, predictors, independent variables, and so on. These things are typically what we're interested in associating with our response variable y. And then we have betas, which are our fixed effect parameters. These are things like our intercept and our slope. These are the things that we're estimating in this model. And epsilon is random error. Linear models are really powerful and flexible. There's lots of different applications of linear models that don't really seem like linear models at first, but under the hood, they actually are. So some examples of linear models: splines, analysis of variance, or ANOVA, penalized regression, things like ridge and lasso, linear mixed effects models, and lots of many other complex techniques are really linear models under the hood. So the nuances of their utility are often misunderstood, and there are certain situations where I notice people think they can't use a linear model, but actually a linear model is a really good tool to solve their problem. So I think one of the reasons for this is that assumptions in a linear model are actually made directly on the errors, not the response. So we would think about our errors being Gaussian as one particular assumption, not necessarily the response. It would be the response given the explanatory variable. So just a little bit of nuance. All I want to say here is that linear models are really powerful and applicable in a wide variety of scenarios. They are fit in R using the LM function. There are two main arguments to LM. The first is the formula that describes the relationship between our response variable and our explanatory variables. The second is the data frame that holds these variables. We see here there's lots of information that's printed out to the R console. If we summarize our linear model object, we see the original function call, some residuals. We see this coefficients table that contains the slope parameter estimates and quantifications of uncertainty and the standard error, as well as p-values for those things. And then some summary of the model. We have a residual standard error estimate, adjusted R squared, things like that. So when we use a linear model, one implicit assumption that we're making is that observations are independent of one another, meaning that observation 1 doesn't share any information with observation 2, and so on. But for spatial data, this assumption is typically impractical. And the reason that it's impractical is because of this fundamental law or axiom called Tobler's law. And it says that nearby observations tend to be more similar than distant observations. So a straightforward statement, but there's a lot there. It's also called the first law of geography. Sometimes Tobler's law is referred to as that. And a big focus of what we're going to talk about today is how this can affect your models. So I'm going to show rather than tell here in the first part of this big picture. So what I'm going to do is actually simulate some data from what we call a spatial linear model. We'll talk a lot more about the structure of this, but for now, notice that there's components in here that we recognize from the linear model, but there's this additional component here called tau. This is spatial random error, and what makes this linear model a spatial linear model. As also the variables that we have here, y, x1, and x2, are recorded at locations with xy coordinates. So we'll make that assumption for this model here. Because this is a simulation study, I get to manipulate truth, so to speak. So I'm going to simulate data according to this fact that I'm setting the beta 1 parameter equal to 0, so it actually has no true relationship to the response variable that we're simulating. And then I'm going to set beta 2 equal to 1, so beta 2 actually does have an influence on the response variable. So our goal here, we're going to simulate a random set of data, and we want to use the data to build models and use them to estimate beta 1 and beta 2. We're going to build two different models, a non-spatial model that assumes independence, and then a spatial model that accounts for spatial covariance. Sometimes you'll see the word non-spatial model be interchangeable with independence model in spatial statistics, so just know that those two things, for at least for the purposes of what we're talking about now, are synonymous. So we simulated a single set of data. This is what the response variable looks like. When we look at this, we see there is some spatial structure. Naturally, we see that the response variables are highest over here in the right part of the domain, lowest here in the top left. Importantly, we see a lot of values that are similar based on their location. So values that are nearby one another tend to have similar values of the response variable. So we see this, and implicitly we recognize it as spatial data. So I fit the models to these data. Let's recall that the true value that we simulated of beta 1 was equal to 0. So if we fit a model and we estimate beta 1, we hope that there's a large p-value associated with this. We wouldn't want to assume that this thing is functionally related to the response, and so we would hope that for a reasonable alpha level, we wouldn't reject a null hypothesis there. So in the table, I have parameter inference for beta 1 in these models, so the estimate of beta 1 as well as standard errors, p-values, and confidence intervals. Importantly, for the non-spatial model that assumes independence, we have a really small p-value, which is not good. This is the wrong decision. We see that the true value of 0 is well outside this confidence interval that goes from minus 0.68 to minus 0.47. For the spatial model, however, our p-value is much more reasonable. And the true value of beta 1 being 0 is in this 95% confidence interval here. So unfortunately, with the non-spatial model, we would reject a null hypothesis here with a reasonable alpha level, and for the spatial model, we wouldn't. So we made the correct decision with the spatial model and not so with the non-spatial. How about a case where beta 2 actually is different from 0? In this situation, we would hope beta 2 has a small p-value. For the non-spatial model, we see actually here there's a large p-value. And so that's also not good, because we hope that we find evidence that beta 2 is different from 0. So we see the value of 0 is in this 95% confidence interval. For the spatial model, though, the estimate is much closer to the true value of 1. We have a really small p-value, and the value of 1 is in our 95% confidence interval here. So we made the correct decision again for the spatial model, not for the non-spatial model. Another way to sort of assess model performance may be to use a technique like cross-validation. So here we have a leave one out cross-validation exercise that we performed for both models. So on the x-axis here, we have a leave one out cross-validation prediction. In short, how we get this is we pretend that we don't have observation 1 in the data, we fit a model to the rest of the data, and we use that model to actually predict observation 1. So then we have a prediction of observation 1 from a model that ignored it, as well as the corresponding true value. Then we can put that back, we can repeat it for observation 2, so on and so forth, until we have a full vector of observations and corresponding predictions, and then we can compare those things using metrics like root mean squared prediction error and R-squared. So on the left, in the non-spatial model, we have a root mean squared prediction error of 0.86 and R-squared of 0.36. We see a lot of deviance from this one-to-one line, especially in this region here. For the spatial model, we have a much lower or better root mean squared prediction error, 0.31, and then a much higher or better R-squared. And visually, we see a lot more adherence to this one-to-one line. So I know that I just showed you a single simulated data set, but these types of results that we see happen all the time and are reinforced throughout decades of literature. So fundamentally, fitting non-spatial linear models to spatial data can lead to a few negative consequences. First, increased type 1 error rate for beta or false positives, so rejecting when there is actually no signal. This was the first example with beta 1. As well as increased type 2 error rates for beta, a false negative. This would be the second example. Synonymously, you could say decreased power would be the same thing. Importantly, also, this potential incoherence in our true correct decisions for beta can lead to a flawed understanding of the ecological system, consequently poor management decisions that result from that. So we want to learn a little bit more about how spatial linear models fitting these to spatial data can help remedy these concerns. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is why some of this actually happens from an intuition perspective. And the reason for this is that spatial data share information. If I have information about one observation, I probably know something about a nearby location. And this implies a form of pseudo-replication. So what pseudo-replication is it just means that you have less independent pieces of information in your data than your sample size. If you had truly independent data, you would have basically as much independent information as you had out of that data set. But when pseudo-replication occurs, you don't. Spatial models work well because they account for this pseudo-replication far more appropriately than non-spatial models. And spatial statistics as a discipline relies on studying this type of pseudo-replication and how it impacts analyses of spatial data. So we're focusing on linear and generalized linear models today and how pseudo-replication affects those, but pseudo-replication affects everything. It affects all types of other models, like machine learning models. It affects visualizations of data, summary statistics. It kind of has its hands everywhere, so it's important to learn about. So I've gone on and on about some of the benefits of spatial models, but if they're more effective than non-spatial models, why do you not see them used that frequently in literature? And there's a couple reasons for this, at least from my perspective. The first is technical challenges. So spatial statistics is a relatively new discipline in the context of statistics, and there's a lot of theory that goes into some of these models. The second is computational challenges. So directly implementing a spatial linear model that we'll talk about today, it really struggles for sample sizes that get much above 3,000. Computational burden starts to really weigh these down and make them infeasible for larger sample sizes. And oftentimes in ecology, we can have really big data sets. And then third is software challenges. So historically, there's been a lack of accessible software to fit these types of spatial models. So some solutions to these problems over the past couple decades, accessibility to these types of models has really expanded, especially over the past decade. There have been lots of developments technically, computationally, and especially in software. There's lots of really awesome software out there for working with spatial data and fitting spatial models. Our contribution that I'm going to talk about today is the spmodel R package. What is spmodel? Well, it's an R package for spatial statistics designed primarily to simplify the transition from non-spatial to spatial, linear, and generalized linear models. How do we do this? Primarily, we build upon both the LM and the GLM function from base R to extend these models to account for what we call spatial covariance. spmodel has been used in the past 2 years for lots of different applications. I've just included a few examples of recent uses in the ways that it's been used. It's been used in some forestry applications to study presence-absence data, fish biodiversity, trends in streams, eco-resilience indices, modeling total atmospheric nitrogen, air temperature modeling, flower color variation modeling, so on and so forth. And then also it's been used as a supplement to a statistics textbook on spatial linear models for ecological and environmental data by Dale, Zimmerman, and Jay Verhoef that came out in 2024. Okay, with that, we're going to jump into some technical background, and we will use that to build up and talk more about spatial covariance and spatial linear models. First, I want to briefly define what a spatial process is. Sometimes that word is used. So we define a spatial process as y of s, where S is in D. So what are all those terms? Y of S is the response variable. It's measured at a location S in some spatial domain D. So typically with data that we work with, S is two-dimensional. It's composed of an X coordinate and a Y coordinate. So we have information at those XY coordinates, and those are taken with respect to some spatial area. Maybe it's a field, or maybe it's a state, something like that. That's what is D. So we can use the spatial process framework to describe a few different types of spatial data. The first is what we call geostatistical or point reference data. These type of data occur when Y of S is random and D is fixed and continuous. So what does that mean? Y of S being random, that's our response variable. Say we're measuring sulfate deposition at locations in some field. So the field would be our domain D, and then we know the locations at which we are going to be measuring sulfate, but theoretically we could measure it anywhere in the field. So we could pick any of the potentially infinite XY locations and measure sulfate there. So at least in my experience, most ecological field data is geostatistical. This is the standard type of spatial data you collect while you're field sampling or doing observational studies. You go out into the field to a site, you collect a bunch of data at that site, and that falls under this geostatistical framework. The second type of spatial data is aerial, sometimes called lattice or polygon data. With aerial data, Y of S is also random, D is also fixed, but now D is discrete. So our response variable Y of S could be total income for each county in a state. So D is our domain state, but now there's only a discrete number of possible locations. So in this example, there's a discrete number of counties in the state. And so because there are a discrete number of counties, this would be considered aerial data. The third type of spatial data is a little bit different. This is point pattern data. And with point pattern data, D, the spatial domain, is actually what's random and of interest. So where things occur is the primary process that we're studying. So for example, this could be the location of main shock earthquakes. Do they occur together? Do they not? That would be an example of point pattern data. So a clarification, spmodel provides tools for both geostatistical and aerial data, not point pattern data. So this covers the scenarios where we're measuring a variable Y of S and D is fixed. Because these types of data are different, we can think about distance differently in both of them. So how do we measure distance? This is a fundamental theme that we'll revisit. With geostatistical data, we measure distance by Euclidean distance. This will be the primary focus of the talk today. We measure aerial distance with a neighborhood structure. So going back to the county example, we may know that counties are neighbors if they share a border, but it may not make sense to use Euclidean or straight line distance for a neighborhood structure. And so that's kind of one of the main differences in the way we handle those types of distances. But fortunately, the tools that we have for modeling are applicable to both these types of data, and they're both unified via the spatial and generalized linear model. Also, sometimes you'll see this of S carried through when these processes are written, and that's just to remind you that these things are measured at a particular location. Just for notational simplicity, we're going to drop this of S. We'll assume it implicitly, so we're going to write this spatial process notation of S. We're going to drop it, but just know that these things are generally measured with respect to a specific location. So before we talk about spatial covariance, what is covariance? Broadly, it's a measure of how similar two random variables are. The correlation between two random variables is just a scaled unitless version of the covariance, so you'll often see these terms used interchangeably. These two variables have a positive covariance, so as x increases, typically y increases as well. In this example, they have a negative covariance. As x increases, y tends to decrease. And then in this third example, these two random variables have no covariance. So there's no relationship that we can glean from y by knowing something about x. Sometimes in spatial statistics, you'll see this auto thrown around. So covariance is referred to as autocovariance. Correlation is referred to as autocorrelation. Technically, auto, in other words, serial means with itself. So you'll see autocorrelation used in time series, for example, where we're thinking about correlation with between different days, so the same series that we're measuring on different days. But sometimes these things are used interchangeably. We're going to drop the auto. So when we talk about covariance, if you see autocovariance, generally that just means the same thing. So a lot of synonymous terms that get used. So I just want to clarify that a lot of these things are the same. The blanket term dependence is less precise than either covariance or correlation, but almost always means covariance or correlation. So if you see someone talking about spatial dependence, generally what they mean is that we are measuring similarity through covariance or correlation. So a lot of words used similarly. Okay, now we're going to build up, talk about spatial covariance. So Tobler's law, this first law of geography, things that are nearby are more similar than distant things. We formalize this notion with what we call spatial covariance, and that's going to be a measure of how similar observations are to one another based on their distance apart. Spatial data tend to exhibit positive spatial covariance, which means that nearby observations are more similar than distant ones. Spatial processes, typically we assume they're governed by some parameters that control what we call the strength of spatial covariance. The stronger the spatial covariance in that process, the more pronounced the spatial patterning that you see visually. So here I want to look at a few different realizations of spatial processes. So these first three are realizations from a strong spatial process. We see nearby values are quite similar. If we look at another realization, we'll have different values, but you should still see that strong spatial pattern. Now the values that are larger are in the bottom left here, but we still see visually that spatial structure. If we look at another pattern, we see that again. Now we're going to simulate data from a weak spatial process. And you'll notice here that a lot of that previous structure is gone. We see a lot of values that are large, nearby some smaller values. We don't see a lot of that smooth spatial structure in this particular realization. Looking at another realization from that same weak spatial process, we see the same thing, large values, nearby small values, and then so on and so forth. So the way that we actually measure this strength of spatial covariance is using what we call a spatial covariance function. The first piece of this is that the covariance is based on h, which is the distance between the two locations, that straight line or Euclidean distance. The next piece of this spatial covariance is this first component. So there's really two parts of what we call the spatial covariance. The first is the spatial piece. The second is this non-spatial piece. This spatial piece is composed of first a variance parameter. We call it sigma squared DE. It's the spatially dependent variance. If you are familiar with spatial statistics literature, this is also called the partial CIL. And this controls the magnitude of the spatial structure of the covariance. And then its shape is controlled by this f function. So f is a function of h and phi. H is the distance here, and then the range parameter is phi. And so this functional form just takes upon different potential functions. So there's lots of different functions, ways that we describe the spatial covariance. There's a lot of history into developing these things. They need to work in every scenario or be positive definite. But a lot of them have relatively simple forms out on the other side of that. So for example, the first one is the exponential function, which just raises this minus distance divided by the range parameter to e. The Gaussian does the same thing, but squares it. Spherical does some other stuff. The second piece of the spatial covariance function is actually non-spatial variability. So this is independent variance controlled by the sigma squared IE parameter. In spatial statistics, this is often called the nugget. So really what the nugget captures is resampling variability. So if I went out to my field and I sampled again tomorrow, I probably wouldn't observe the exact same value. And so there's a little bit of extra variability that is non-spatial in nature, but still should be accounted for. So the total variance then of this spatial covariance function is the sum of sigma squared DE and IE. These things control the magnitude of those different spatial and non-spatial pieces. Sometimes nomenclature differs when we're talking about these things. I realize it's a little bit confusing to talk about a spatial covariance function being composed of a spatial piece and a non-spatial piece. Sometimes people just talk about the spatial piece being this, and then talk about the independent piece separately. So you can kind of get those two different things. So just be aware that potentially nomenclature differs depending on which resource you're looking at. So the important takeaway of the spatial covariance functions is that they all have different shapes governed by their functional form and their parameter values to describe spatial covariance as a function of distance. So these are just different parameter and functional form combinations. We see that all of them decrease in their spatial covariance on the y-axis as the x-axis distance increases. So this means as things get farther apart from one another, they have less spatial covariance. That matches intuition. They can decay at different rates. So we have some that start at higher values of the spatial covariance and then decay to zero quickly. We have some that are more smooth, so on and so forth. So again, just the important takeaway is that there are different ways to describe this spatial covariance using different functional forms that contain parameters that we can actually estimate from our data. So takeaways from this spatial covariance section. First, spatial data tend to be more similar at nearby locations. This is Tobler's law. We measure spatial covariance using a spatial covariance function that depends on distance, variance parameters, and what we call a range parameter. And then we saw in the big picture motivation, spatial linear models are more realistic and effective for spatial data than non-spatial linear models. So what are we going to dive into next? We're going to talk about a linear model for spatial data a little more concretely. This is the spatial linear model. We're going to fit them in R using the SPLM function from spmodel. We're going to estimate spatial covariance of Y given those explanatory variables. We're going to talk about all pieces of building a model, so model inference, model diagnostics, model comparison, and then we'll make predictions at new locations. This is sometimes called kriging. Okay. So the spatial linear model here, we see again our familiar terms. We have our response variable y, our explanatory variables x's, and our betas, the fixed effect parameters. What's new here is this tau term. So this is the spatially dependent random error. You'll notice that the covariance of tau specifically is that first piece of the spatial covariance function we saw earlier. Second, we have epsilon. This is the independent or non-spatial random error. This is the second piece of that function we just explored. So everything that we've learned about spatial covariance translates to estimation of the parameters that govern these random errors, tau and epsilon. So our modeling actually of spatial covariance is on the tau and the epsilon terms and the parameters that compose that function. So the inclusion of tau is what makes this model what we call a spatial linear model. Whether or not a model is a spatial linear model, depending on the structure of each of its explanatory variables, is irrelevant. So, for example, the spatial structure or lack thereof for an xi does not determine whether something's a spatial linear model. So xi could be temperature or precipitation, which often are highly spatially structured themselves. The following model is a non-spatial linear model because it doesn't have that tau spatial random error that implies spatial covariance in y. So whether or not x1 is spatially structured, could be temperature, could be precip, this model is not a spatial linear model. The second model, however, is a spatial linear model because of the inclusion of this tau term. How are parameters estimated of these models? There are lots of different options available in spmodel through the est method argument. Restricted maximum likelihood, or REML, is the default. Maximum likelihood is also available. These first two are likelihood-based methods. They assume a Gaussian likelihood for the distribution of the response variable given the explanatory variables, and then we find the parameters that maximize those likelihoods. The second two, Cressy's semivariogram-based weighted least squares and Guerrero and Lele's semivariogram-based composite likelihood. These are examples of semivariogram-based estimation methods. So if you're familiar with semivariograms, there are ways to estimate the parameters from those, and so those are also available for estimation methods. The important point, though, is that explanatory variables are accounted for while estimating the spatial covariance parameters of those random errors, and vice versa. All of these things are sort of accounted for simultaneously. So we're going to explore using spmodel to do some of this stuff using the lake data. So the lake data comes packaged with spmodel. It's an SF object. It has data from 102 lakes in 4 southwestern U.S. states: Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. SF objects are really cool. They are the modern SP object. In short, what they do is enhance a data frame or a tibble to include geographic information. That's the long and the short of it. You append geographic information to your data. So if we print the lake object here, we see the first few rows of this summary contain some geometric information. We have the geometry type point, meaning that observations are measured at point locations or point reference locations. So these are geostatistical data. We have a bounding box, a projection, so on and so forth. We have several variables here. We have a common identifier based on the NHD. We have log conductivity, which is a measure of salinity at the lake. We have the state, temperature, precip, elevation, lake origin, whether the lake is naturally occurring or human-made, and then the year that the data were collected. So quick visualization of log conductivity here. We see our 4 states. We see log conductivity, which will be our eventual response variable. When we look at this variable, we do see some of that spatial patterning. For example, here we see a lot of high values together. Here we see some lower values together, so on and so forth. So our goal is to fit a spatial linear model to study the impact of elevation and lake origin on log conductivity while accounting for spatial covariance. So this is just an illustrative example, and suppose this was the particular research question that I'm interested in. So to fit these models in SPLM, we need 3 arguments. The first 2 are familiar from LM. The first is formula. This describes that relationship between my response variable, log conductivity, being modeled as a function of both elevation and lake origin. The second argument is data, which contains the lake SF object or data frame, and then the third argument is the spatial covariance type. So remember, we showed a few of those different types. We had exponential, Gaussian, spherical. There's many more in SP model, but that's what is governed by SPCov type here. Sometimes it can be additional work to get an SF object together, so you can still use SPLM if you don't have an SF object. You simply provide the X-coord and the Y-coord arguments to SPLM. So as long as those things are variables in your data frame, you can just supply those X-coord and Y-coord arguments. When we summarize the SPLM object, we get, again, something that looks really similar to LM. We get the original function call. We have our summary of residuals. We have our coefficients corresponding to the fixed effects. So those are our estimates of the slope parameters, their standard errors, associated p-values. We have a pseudo R-squared, which emulates that R-squared, meaning from the summary how much variability in my data is explained by those fixed effects. And then we have estimates of the parameters corresponding to the exponential spatial covariance. So we have DE, which is that variance parameter that controls the magnitude of spatial structure. We have IE, which is the magnitude of non-spatial structure, and then the range that's corresponding with that spatial covariance. So this is a lot of useful, informative information, but it's a little bit hard to use directly. It's printed right out to the R console. It's hard to copy and paste, and it's just generally not super easy to take this information and put it somewhere else, be that R, be that a table in a CSV, something like that. So the Broom R package really makes some nice headway into making that problem of summary not being super useful immediately more tractable. So Broom converts statistical model output into what we call tidy tibbles. It's part of the tidy models ecosystem, which is part of the broader tidyverse structure. So there are 3 functions in Broom primarily, and all of these are defined for SP model objects. So the first one, tidy. Tidy is the model output. Glance will glance at the model fit, and then augment will augment the data with something. So first is tidy. So if we tidy the spatial linear model object, we get back a data frame or a tibble that is directly usable. We know how to manipulate data frames. We know how to write them out to CSVs. We know how to quickly make visualizations of them, all sorts of things. So this puts all that information into a useful structure. So we see the terms here as well as their estimates, standard errors, and p-values. There's lots of additional arguments to tidy that control other things. For example, if you want confidence intervals for those parameters, simply supply the conf.int argument. The second Broom function, glance, will quickly glance at the model fit. So glances are always one-row summaries of the model fit. We see here from left to right returns the sample size, the number of estimated explanatory variables, the number of estimated spatial covariance parameters, likelihood-based statistics like AIC, AICC, BIC, and we also see the pseudo R-squared here as well. The third one is augment, which is my personal favorite. Augment will augment the data used to fit the model with model diagnostics. So we see here that it returns an SF object because the original data was an SF object. We see the data used to fit the model. We have log cond, elevation, and origin, and then we have these 5 additional columns that are added. So what are these additional columns that are added by augment? The first is .fitted. These are the fitted values, and these are sort of the average values according to the slope parameters in the model. We have our residuals. These are those errors. We have hat values, which we call leverage values. These measure how unusual a particular set of explanatory variables are relative to average behavior. We have Cook's-D, which is Cook's distance, a measure of influence, tells you how influential a single observation is on a particular model fit. We don't want one observation having a extremely high Cook's distance, for example, because results would change a lot if that particular value was taken out. And then finally, we have std.resid. These are standardized residuals. The reason that these are useful is because they have been decorrelated and have a variance of 1. So these raw residuals actually are still allowed to have spatial structure. And so if you're thinking about doing diagnostic checks, the raw residuals may be slightly misleading. So we would look at the standardized residuals instead, because those have been accounted for the spatial structure. If you'd prefer to use direct helper functions that you're used to in R, like fitted, for example, those are available for all these quantities as well. Plot is also available on spmodel objects. So the standardized residuals are typically the default residuals that are used when looking at the diagnostics that you're familiar with from plot. So for example, the first plot that is returned by plot on an LM object would be the fitted versus residuals. Here it's the fitted versus the standardized residuals. And so we would inspect this and look for the same sort of patterns that we're accustomed to if we were to look at assumptions for a linear model. So here, I don't really see any obvious pattern between the standardized residuals and fitted values, which is good. It doesn't suggest some systematic poor performance of the model. So if we go back to the actual parameters DE, IE, and range, and knowing that we have an exponential form, we can actually plug those values in and get the fitted spatial covariance curve according to the model. So this is what it looks like. We also have this available as one of the plot outputs. And so we see here the distance decay of the covariance with distance. And we can sort of infer, okay, well, at sort of this particular value, things seem, approximately independent, maybe, if the covariance is decayed to 0, or they're still strongly correlated, so on and so forth. So you can tell a lot about the structure of the covariance from looking at this diagnostic plot. Next is spatial prediction, or kriging. So often a primary goal is to predict the spatial process at new locations. Usually this is one of two primary goals. The first is to understand the ecological variables that are related to my response, and the second is to predict at new locations or forecast. So kriging, best linear unbiased prediction, spatial prediction, forecasting, prediction, these are all synonymous words for this task. Importantly, explanatory variables that went into the model must also be in the prediction data. This includes coordinates. So my goal here is to predict log conductivity at 10 lakes and Lake Preds. Lake Preds is another SF object that comes with spmodel. It has data for everything but log conductivity, which is the response variable, the thing that we're interested in predicting. Here are the locations of those lakes and lake preds represented by the large black triangles. These are the locations that we want to make predictions at. If I were to make predictions using LM, I would simply supply the LM object and then the new data set. And for spmodel, it works the same way. So I provide the model object spmod, my new data set lake preds, and then I get predictions of log conductivity at those 10 locations in lake preds. You can also use augment, and this is the reason why augment is my personal favorite, because it has a dual use. Before, we just gave it the fitted model object and it returned diagnostics. Now we are giving it the new data, and it's going to augment that new data with predictions. So notice that that new data set now has a new column called .fitted that contains those predictions. And the really cool thing about using SF objects, especially with augmenting prediction data, is that it makes for really quick spatial visualizations. You already have the SF structure. There's geom SF, which works really nicely with ggplot, though SF also has some plotting functionality as well. And so combining augment and SF object just helps us quickly visualize these predictions spatially. So when I look at these, I see that the color of the triangle sort of matches the color of nearby locations, and so this sort of passes the eye test, so to speak. Quantifying uncertainty in predictions is also really important. I think this is really a benefit of more traditional statistical approaches to prediction problems, is that oftentimes uncertainty quantification is baked in, whereas sometimes, it's a little more challenging with some of the machine learning algorithms to quantify it in the same way. So if I were to use predict here and supply the interval argument prediction, I get back a predictions in this fit column and then lower and upper bounds of a 95% prediction interval. I can also supply those additional arguments to augment. So if I return, or if I give it the interval argument, then the lower and upper columns are augmented to the prediction data as well. So far we've motivated spatial linear models mostly with a first principles argument. So I've said that Tobler's law is this thing that we see a lot in nature, and so our models should emulate that. But really, we should know whether they're a better fit and worth all of this effort. So one way that I can look at this empirically is to fit a non-spatial linear model, compare it to the spatial linear model, and see which one is better according to some specific metric. I'm going to fit this non-spatial model using SPLM and giving the SP-cov type equals none. So if I run this code, it's going to give me the same fit as an LM object. The reason that I'm showing you this is because there's a lot of specific SP model helper functions. One of them that we'll explore is leave one out cross-validation that work for SP model objects, but not for LM objects. And so accessing some of those SP model specific helpers is why you can fit them with SPLM and SP-cov type being none. So the first model comparison tool that we'll use are likelihood-based statistics, AIC, AICC, and BIC. These statistics balance model fit with model parsimony. Generally, lower is better. And so the spatial model here has lower values of the AIC, the AICC, and the BIC than the non-spatial model. So this is one line of evidence that the spatial model is fitting better. Second, the spatial model is strongly preferred via leave one out cross-validation. So back at the start, we talked about leave one out cross-validation being this sort of hold out, leave one out approach to evaluate predictive capacity of the model. So for the non-spatial and the spatial linear models, both are unbiased, so they get it correct on average, which is good. But the spatial model is more efficient. It has lower mean square prediction error and root mean square prediction error. It also has higher values of core 2, which is what we call predictive R squared. So this is the squared correlation between the observations and the leave one out predictions. So a second line of evidence that the spatial model is more effective here. I want to quickly talk about a cautionary note. This is a question I get a lot, and so I just want to mention it. Pseudo R squared, this is how much variability in my model is attributable to my explanatory variables. This is a useful diagnostic, but it is not a model selection tool. So I printed out the pseudo R squareds of the two models here. I would advise that you don't use this as a model selection tool, but you can use predictive R squared. For example, this is core 2 from the leave one out. You can use this as a model selection tool. So why is this? Confusion arises from the fact that R squared has two different meanings simultaneously when models assume independence. The first definition is variability attributable to the explanatory variables. This is what we call the pseudo R squared in this spatial linear model case. And then the second is the squared correlation between the fitted or the predicted values and the data. And this is what we call predictive R squared. So with a non-spatial model, these definitions are actually equivalent, but once you get out of that independence case, so even just a linear mixed effects model, a model with some complex correlation structure like a spatial structure, these definitions are not equivalent. So there's got to be some care there when comparing them. And so I can talk more about that if people are interested, but I just wanted to put that cautionary note in there. So we talked about comparing a specific spatial model to a non-spatial model, but what if I want to compare two different spatial models? If you don't know which spatial models to choose, I think there's 18 that you can potentially choose for an SPLM object. The two that I recommend starting with are exponential and Gaussian. If you are calling SPLM, you can actually give a vector to SP-cov type, and so this way you don't have to have several different SPLM calls, you can just give it a vector and it will return a list with all of the different model fits in those. I can fit that and quickly glance at all of the models by running the glances function, and that will return in order of AICC, by default at least, the model having the lowest value. So here we see the Gaussian has the lowest AICC. It has a very similar value to exponential up to like the third decimal point, I think. But there is a big difference between the non-spatial model. So don't stress too much about choosing the best spatial covariance function, because typically the gap between the non-spatial model and the worst spatial model is much larger than the gap between the worst spatial model and the best spatial model. So if you only have a finite energy for model checking and model building and things like that, I think it makes more sense, at least in my workflow, to focus more of that energy on, are my research questions what I intend them to be? How is the data quality? Have I omitted any potentially important explanatory variables in the model? Things like that. Quickly going back a slide, the reason that I recommend people start with exponential and Gaussian is because they're relatively well behaved, and they also have fairly different origin behaviors, or behaviors at really small distances. And there's been a lot of work in spatial statistics literature, notably by Michael Stein, that talk about how that's really the most important stuff to get right. So because they're quite different near that origin, these are kind of the two that I recommend people start with. Okay, so takeaways. Spatial linear models extend linear models to account for what we call spatial covariance. We fit these using the SPLM function and spmodel. The Broom functions are particularly helpful for understanding more about our model, tidy, glance, and augment. And then there are all sorts of tools for model inference, diagnostics, prediction, and comparison in spmodel. What's coming next? I'll give you a quick overview of some additional spmodel features and end on some closing thoughts. And then, if time, we'll talk about applications to large data sets in spatial GLMs, depending on questions and things like that. So some additional spmodel features. There's lots of additional arguments to SPLM. We really just explored sort of the most introductory scenario. So one of those is anisotropy. So by default, we assume that spatial covariance decays the same in all directions. You may not want to make that assumption. You may want spatial covariance to decay differently in different directions. And so you could control that through the anisotropy argument. The random argument is for non-spatial random effects, so you would use the same syntax to specify these as you would with LME4 or NLME if you have a non-spatial thing to account for, like year, for example. Partition factor, this imposes some additional constraints on a spatial covariance function. Suppose that you had two fields that were far apart and you wanted to model spatial covariance within fields but not across fields. You would specify field as a partition factor there. You can set specific initial values or even hold values as fixed and known through spcov initial. You can change the estimation method, things like that. And there's even some additional arguments. There's lots of additional modeling tools that work on spmodel objects. Maybe you want to do an analysis of variance with the ANOVA function. spmodel fully supports working with the EM_means R package for estimated marginal means of model objects. It supports things like VIF, or variance inflation factors, from CAR. Block kriging is often something that is of interest to people too. If you want to predict the average or the total in a spatial region, you can supply the block argument to predict. Varicomp is a diagnostic that separates the different pieces of variability in your model according to the explanatory variables, the spatial structure, the non-spatial structure, things like that. For applications to large data sets, these are controlled via the local argument. Spatial generalized linear models are fit with SPGLM instead of GLM. Spatial linear and generalized linear models for aerial data are specified with the spAutoR and spgAutoR functions. These are sometimes called autoregressive models, so that's where the AutoR comes from. There's lots of exploratory tools for fitting empirical semivariograms and empirical autocorrelation functions, ESV and EACF. There's functions for simulating spatial data. These put the SP prefix on the sort of base R implementations, so SPR norm, SPR binom, for example. And then there's some spatial machine learning tools, SPLMRF, for example, for a spatial take on random forests. And then there's a lot more stuff coming that we have planned. So what's the pitch for spmodel? What are some reasons to add it to your toolbox? Fundamentally, it's a really general tool that extends LM and GLM for spatial data. There's lots of additional features to capture different nuances of the research question that you're asking. It's integrated with the existing R ecosystem, so the base and stats R packages, as well as Broom, EM means, and CAR, and it's also in active development. A different type of pitch that I make sometimes to people is if you get a question from a reviewer that says, did you study the impact of spatial covariance on your data? And now you can say yes. And the nice thing about fitting these spatial models is that sort of in the worst case, the non-spatial model is just a special case of the spatial model. So if you set that sigma squared DE to 0, you get back the non-spatial model. And so most of the time, spatial models will fit a lot better, but you can always, compare to that baseline of a non-spatial model. So that's a handy thing to keep in mind. What are some reasons to potentially prefer an alternative to spmodel? Maybe you're doing a point process analysis. SpatStat is a good R package for that. Maybe you're doing a Bayesian application. spmodel uses only frequentist application. So if you want to go Bayesian, spBayes, RInla are some examples of packages. Or maybe there's some other functionality critical to your workflow that spmodel doesn't cover. So joint species distribution models, ordination, spatial stream networks, and mixture models. These are all types of things that are much better suited for other R packages. If you do use spmodel, please do cite it. This helps us a lot. Keeps track of uses, helps us justify future development resources, things like bug fixes, updates, etc. Sometimes there's some confusion about whether our packages are supposed to be cited, but that would help us out a lot. For the most up-to-date resources about spmodel, check out our website. We have documentation for all of our functions in the reference tab. We have vignettes, which are like short-form articles that describe different functionality of the package. In the articles tab, there's ones for an introductory look at spmodel, a detailed guide, generalized linear models, EM means integration, block prediction, and technical details. And then there's some workshops that we've done that are linked in there as well. What things are we excited about for the future? We just had a paper accepted at Journal of Statistical Software on spatial generalized linear models in R using spmodel. That should come out in 2026 sometime. Myself and another colleague are working on an open source textbook, tentatively titled A Practical Introduction to Spatial Statistics in R, but it'll kind of be structured a lot like this talk and use spmodel to motivate a lot of concepts. Currently, we expect that to come out in 2028, but it's quite tentative at this point. And then things like space-time models, conditional simulation, additional machine learning tools. These are all things that we have on the horizon for spmodel. We are always interested in hearing from you. We want it to be as useful as possible. We've built it for you, and so please let us know what you want in it. And we want to make it as effective as possible. So I have my email here, where to go for bugs and suggestions. Users have suggested a lot of things recently: EM means integration, different empirical semivariogram tools, auto covariance and correlation functions. These have all been things that users have asked for. And then I'm certainly open to potential seminars, workshops, and other collaborations as time permits. So don't hesitate to reach out and email me. A special thank you to the Statistical Ecology section of ESA and the officers. A special thanks to Jeff and Jody for all the correspondence. Thanks to ESA and then FE for hosting and for the invitation. A special shout out to my code developers, Matt Hyam and Jay Verhoof, as well as EPA colleagues that helped me a lot with dry runs of this presentation: Darren Kopp, Ryan Hill, and Amanda Nalick. And then most importantly, thank you for attending today. I know everyone's busy. I really appreciate you spending 90 minutes with me. You can contact me at the email here. I have my primary email at epa.gov and then my secondary email at oregonstate.edu. I want to open it up for questions. And also potentially talk about applications to large data sets or spatial GLMs. So we'll kind of gauge where the questions are and then see if we have time for some of those additional features. If you are interested in the additional features and we don't have time to get to them, they're in the slides as well. So, if you want to learn about applications to large data sets, they're all in the slides, which are posted on the FE GitHub page. Okay, I will break for questions.
Okay, first question is, do you see SP model fitting into workflows where the downstream analysis is multivariate? For example, using spatial residues from a fitted model as input to PCA or clustering. And you are muted, Michael.
I am muted. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. I do, though I will acknowledge that that is not a specialty of SP model at this time. I think if you can frame a potential uh, am I back?
You're back.
Yes, you're back.
Okay. If you can frame the problem as something that you can capture the multivariate response through like a random effect for like a repeated measure, maybe a good example, then certainly in that multivariate context, you can apply to SP model. But as far as like more species specific stuff, there's currently no functionality for that, though I would recommend some of Jeff's software for that stuff.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Second question is, when would you use a spatial model versus a linear mixed model with something like plot or site as a random effects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I would typically use a spatial model in every scenario where I have spatial data. So oftentimes it's really hard to infer what the potential spatial process that you're actually studying is going to be because there are explanatory variables. And so remember that we're modeling the spatial structure after that. And so I don't think you lose anything by fitting a spatial model because again, in the worst case, it's just going to be that standard linear model. And so one of the nice things about a spatial model, insofar as it being different from like a linear mixed effects model that just had like a plot specific random effect, is that prediction at new locations is much more natural. So if you have a random effect for plot and then you want to generalize that to a different plot, that's really sort of very hard to do with existing software. But for a spatial model, you just have the particular coordinates, and so prediction flows really nicely. And I think it also more naturally captures what we think about when we think about nearby plots being similar by modeling spatial covariance as a function of distance. Now, that being said, you can also, sometimes there's things, about a specific plot that still make it a good random effect. So there might be, local variability that you want to capture. And so a lot of ecologists that I work with here at EPA, they fit a spatial model, but then they also specify a non-spatial random effect with the random argument that helps mop up, any additional covariance that's left over that can be attributable to a plot-specific random effect. And I will say in SP model, we did work hard to sort of create a backdoor through the standard R architecture that does make prediction at new levels of the random effect quite straightforward.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next question is, what if your response variable is wildlife movement? And your goal is to model movement as a function of many covariates, like traffic noise and light, topography, etc. Would SP model be a good choice for this?
Yeah, great question. I think that if you're able to construct your response variable as any continuous or even not continuous, we don't have time to get to the GLM stuff, but if you can model the problem and its structure as being something that works well with a spatial linear model or generalized linear model, then certainly it could be applied in those contexts. I will say that animal movement in particular is sort of its whole subdiscipline of spatial statistics that SP model isn't specifically designed for. And there are some other R packages that do specific animal movement models. But I will say that given that it's quite a general framework, I think that it could be applicable in a lot of contexts, though problem dependent. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And then, if is there any fundamental differences? And if so, how? When modeling processes at a small, for example, plot size meters, rather than at a regional scale, so states and regions. So I
Hmm.
think that's a question about scaling, a scale
Yeah,
of different regions. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Great question. No, there's no fundamental difference. Distance is still accounted for in the same way, and I think that the larger the scale that you're on, sort of like the more coarse scale sort of potential ecological patterns you'll pick up. But as far as the fundamental architecture, no, it's the same, irrespective of how large of a particular spatial domain that you're working on. So I know that people have used SP model to study an ecological process in a single small field, and it's been used to study a process throughout the entirety of the conterminous United States.
Mm, okay, makes sense. And for the spatial error term, how can you tease out the spatial info with the existing predictors in your model or other ancillary variables?
Hmm. So the question was,
For the spatial
when
error
when
term,
explanatory variables are spatially patterned, though?
yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a super great question, and it's a really interesting sub-discipline of spatial statistics, studying what happens when your explanatory variables are spatially structured. And my recommendation is, so the explanatory variables, they really are sort of like treated as known and conditioned upon in the modeling structure. And so that's sort of like the framework by which we think about those, just like how in a regular linear model, even if we have two variables that are correlated with one another, we're still like conditioning on those when we fit and interpret the model. So if we're in a scenario where we have an independent model and we have two explanatory variables that are highly correlated, what happens is we have some degree of multicollinearity. And so what happens when we have multicollinearity, it's not wrong in any sense at all. It just makes it harder to discern where potential sources of variability are coming from. So for example, if x1 and x2 highly correlated, the model knows that together they explain a lot of the process, but the model can't really tease apart whether it's X1 or whether it's X2. And so what happens typically is standard errors for those things increase. Or for spatial scenarios, it's similar. So if you have a lot of spatially patterned covariates and a strong spatial signal that is structured in potentially the same way, again, the spatial process, it really like mops up things that we don't have data for, we don't potentially understand. And so it's certainly feasible that it can be correlated with some other variable like temp or precip. And so typically just what happens is explanatory variables that are highly correlated with the estimated process under the hood, their standard errors, just like in the multicollinearity case, go up as well. And so just because you have those things in the model, you still have proper inference on the fixed effects. It's just that the standard errors go up and you tend to be less precise. So the model says, I know together these things explain a lot of stuff, but I can't exactly tease those apart. And so that phenomena happens in spatial statistics too. It's called spatial confounding, but there's certainly nothing wrong about including any of those in the model. Just know that it can potentially decrease precision.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. And another question is how much does the workflow that you need to change for three-dimensional spatial data?
Yeah, three-dimensional spatial data. So the first thing that I would say is it at all possible to potentially have one of those dimensions be an explanatory variable? So oftentimes, if people have like depth, for example, oftentimes the depth is more of an explanatory variable in the way that like we're thinking about it being functionally related to the response than just the particular XY locations in a field. So that's typically what I encourage folks to think about. We would like to potentially add three-dimensional spatial structure to SP model at some point. There's some additional nuances that have to happen there, and so there's no current functionality. But first, think if any of them can be an explanatory variable. would be my solution.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from an undergrad. So the person is a senior undergrad who is interested in freshwater and GIS. And the person is asking, would you be willing to elaborate on what you use spatial statistics when conducting national aquatic resource surveys?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So we use it in all sorts of different applications. We've used it recently to study different temperature trends in rivers and streams throughout the conterminous United States, show how those temperature trends affect fish biodiversity throughout the country, for example. We've used it to study, we've actually used that lake data set as part of a larger data set where we use to characterize some of the major drivers of log conductivity throughout the conterminous US. We've used it to study all sorts of different potential geologic freshwater richness and diversity. So we've used it in those different kind of contexts and several others. So I'm happy to, if that person wants to email me, I'd be happy to meet with you and talk about some of the different ways that we use the data as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. Last question. Would you recommend using this package in determining spatial clustering?
Um, Spatial clustering insofar as like finding maybe like functional compositions of things that are similar, I think is where the question's going.
I think it's just also if you want to do spatial clustering, would you recommend using SP model package? I guess that's based on the question.
Yeah, I think in terms of like using clustering to find different groups um, of things, maybe from like a species composition perspective, we don't have any tools for that. I think that again, if you can one interesting application, though, is potentially maybe there's some specific spatial clustering algorithm that groups species into different subgroups, and then those could be potential explanatory variables in a regression model, similar to how, if you use PCA, you could potentially use those axes as either response or explanatory variables in some more general model.
Okay, thank you. I think I missed one question. This is actually the last one, and it's a long question. So what if
Hmm.
your OLS model is misspecified, like a particular driver or predictor in your linear model does not have a universal relationship with the response variable? So for example, the slope varies across space, and the researcher should have a specified an interaction term. That's a question.
So, if you have so whether or not the model is OLS or independent or spatial, if you have a really important explanatory variable that's omitted, you'll likely have some bias in other parameter estimates and predictions and things like that. I will say that even in situations where that occurs, spatial models tend to do remarkably well at trying to mop up that additional variability, so to speak, by accounting for the spatial structure that's potentially implied by that missing explanatory variable. So certainly, there are consequences of missing a major driver in your system, but the spatial model does tend to be a lot more flexible and robust at remedying a lot of the concerns that come with that.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. There's one question about the slides. I think Judy, you can handle that
Yeah,
afterwards.
there's a big data question. I can talk super quickly about the big data stuff in like 2 minutes.
That'd be great.
Um, okay, awesome. I will zoom to big data. Applications to large data sets. So what I'm doing here, and you can go through the code for some additional details, but I've generated a large data set. SPModel can do much larger than this. We'll talk about this, but just for illustrative purposes, 2,500 observations. Here's what the response variable looks like. Here's what the explanatory variable looks like. Here's the relationship between y versus x. There is a true slope of 1 in these simulated data. Main computational challenge for spatial data has to do with inverting a matrix or working with an inverse. Cubic computational complexity, meaning that if you double the sample size, it can take 8 times as long. That's bad. We have a solution to this problem. There are lots of really neat solutions. Ours is to split the large data set up into smaller data sets and pool the results. So there are two different ways that we can do this. The first is k-means clustering. So we actually do this on the coordinates. And so we have this large data set that may be infeasible. We break it up. Basically, there's a little more nuance, but we basically break it up into 4 smaller data sets, fit models to these 4 smaller data sets, pool the parameter estimates. Additional way you can determine data sets is by a random assignment. Typically, the k-means does a little better just because it has more observations that are really close to other observations. So the way that you specify the big data models, there's lots of additional things you can specify, but for now, all you should remember is that you can implement this model by specifying local equals true. So local is an argument to SPLM, set it equal to true. We have some default big data stuff. So here I've fit a model using the direct approach and the big data approach. You can see here that local equals true is specified. We see the big data approach is much faster. This performance gap really increases with the size of the observed data. We warn you, if your observed data are more than 5,000 rows and say this is going to take a while, you should think about switching. So lunch break computational times, the big data approach, I would say anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million for sort of your lunch break, depending on what variance estimator you use. You can learn more about that in the documentation. So on this example data, I fit using the direct method and the big data method. Notice that the estimates of the slope parameter are nearly identical, as are their standard errors using the standard implementation and the big data. Same for leave one out cross-validation metrics, nearly identical. So the big data model is fitting nearly identically in a fraction of the time. I'm going to skip the spatial covariance. There's some graphs there. For prediction, again, the same challenge is inverting a large matrix or working with that inverse. We have a solution called local neighborhood prediction, where we use only a subset of the observed data to inform the prediction. This is closely related to NNGP ideas. Again, local equals true will specify a bunch of defaults for you, like the way that we determine those neighborhoods. So just remember to set local equals true for prediction. And then we have predictions here using, again, the direct approach using the standard prediction versus the big data model combined with local neighborhood prediction. These have kind of similar computational times, but really this does change drastically as the sample size gets bigger. It's just that this was a bit smaller of a data set. And here are some lunch break computational times. For the big data stuff, about observed data, about 100,000 and 100,000 prediction points is about on your lunch break, though there's parallel processing as well. I have the test data, which we want to make predictions. We have the predictions from the direct approach and the big data approach. They look very similar. Standard errors look very similar. Root mean squared prediction error is nearly identical up to the 4th decimal point. So recap, model fitting, we break it up into subsets, pool the results. All you need to do is provide local equals true. For prediction, we use a subset of the observed data to inform each prediction. That subset of observed data changes based on where the prediction location is. Again, all you need to remember, local equals true.